Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church, and we're still in Second Corinthians. We're going to be in Second Corinthians 11 today, and this is going to be Paul talking about the false apostles that are, well, and actually it should be apostles in quotations here, that are, has kind of permeated or are part of and stirring up trouble in the Corinthian church. And so we'll go through this, and I'm going to, again, like this one, I'm going to read and go and talk about it as we go through it just because it is a little lengthier and there's a lot of notes on this one, so I want to hit these as we go through it. So 2 Corinthians 11, 1 through 15, it says, I hope you will be put up with me a little more. I hope you will put up with a little more of my foolishness. Please bear with me, for I'm jealous for you with the jealousy of God himself. I promised you as a pure bride to one husband, Christ, but I fear that somehow your pure and undivided devotion to Christ will be corrupted, just as Eve was deceived by the cunning ways of the serpent. You happily put up with whatever anyone tells you, even if they preach a different Jesus and then the one we preach than the one we preach, or a different kind of spirit than the one you received, or a different kind of gospel than the one you believed. And so, what he's talking about here is these false apostles, these false uh, preachers who have come in and stirred up problems. They're teaching things that are opposite of the Jesus that they spoke of, the Spirit and gospel that they preach. And most scholars are not 100% sure, excuse me, what the difference was. A lot of them think that they probably were teaching a more powerful, stronger Jesus versus this mild, someone who just allowed them, self to be put on the cross and stuff like that. Again, they're not 100% sure, so it's all guessing, but just as some of the things that Paul kind of hints at, that's where they go. And so he's saying, hey, I wanted you to be pure and tied to Christ, but he's like, I'm afraid this is going to be messed up because you are believing just anything that these people say. And that's why it's important for us as Christians not to just believe anything anyone says. I mean, excuse me, I can remember so much growing up in the church. I'd hear people say, "Well, my preacher said this," and and that's okay to a point, right? It's okay to listen to what your preacher says, but we have to verify. It's like everything I teach. I always tell everyone, just because I get up and say it, don't just take it as concrete 100%. Study it, because I could be wrong. There's, like I've talked about before, there's things I've studied and there are these things I taught maybe 5 years ago that I wouldn't teach today because they're wrong. And so we've always got to be studying and looking at things and diving into, and not just if someone comes in and says, oh, just accept, well, my preacher said this. Well, I'm not trying to be mean, but your preacher could be a false prophet. And so we've got to be very, very, very careful with just accepting something because someone with a title gets up and says it. And that's what Paul's kind of getting up here, say, look, and especially what we're going to look at here in a second is, especially just because they're good at speaking or good at convincing people or things like that. And so he's going to hit on that here in a second. He says in verse 5, but I don't consider myself inferior in any ways to these quote unquote super apostles who teach such things. I may be unskilled as a speaker, but I'm not lacking in knowledge. We may we have made this clear to you in every possible way. And so, so what we see here is that apparently these guys were coming in, and they were referring to themselves as super apostles, like more, I guess, a stronger apostle than like Paul and some of the others. And so, and one of the things Paul talks about, he's not this skilled, excellent, just orator who just is elegant speaker. He's not. He's like he says, look, I'm plain. I come in and I speak plainly, and I just give, it's simple. And so he's like, look, I'm not lacking in knowledge, and we've already proved that. All right, he's already shown that, and so he's letting them know. And so basically, what they were trying to say, these super apostles, which would be in quotations, what they were trying to say is that they were better than Paul because they could speak better, they could do these things, and show. They just were showing off, and so they were bragging that they had better ministries than Paul. So if you get into verse 7, it says, was I wrong when I humbled myself and honored you by preaching God's good news to you without expecting anything in return? I robbed, quote unquote, other churches by accepting their contributions so I could serve you at no cost. And when I was with you and I didn't have enough to live on, I did not become a financial burden to anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia brought me all that I needed. I have never been a burden to you, and I never will be. And surely, as the truth of Christ is in me, no one in all Greece will ever stop me from boasting about this. And so, in this day and age, it was considered, if you were teaching, right, especially in Greek culture, if you were teaching, then you were supposed to be paid. You earned your pay, and you had every right to ask for pay and to be reimbursed. And it was a sign of, to them, they were saying, oh, look, he doesn't take any money. That shows how bad of an apostle he is, like how bad of a teacher he is. He can't even say, hey, you need to give me money. And what Paul's saying is like, no. It's like, and we see mostly that Paul did not take money from any of the churches. We see here that he did accept things from Macedonia, but even then he's saying, the reason I accepted it from Macedonia was because I was not going to be a burden to the Corinth church. I had made that goal my goal, and I wasn't going to be. And so he continued in this. And so these super apostles, these other people who were stirring up trouble, tried to use this against him and say, hey, oh, Paul doesn't accept money because he's not a good apostle. Right? That's why he's not accepting good money. It's just because he's not good at what he's doing. He's not a true apostle. And so and Paul turns around and said, no, I did it because I was not going to be a burden, and I'll brag about that all day long. And so that's what he's saying. He's like, I'm not ashamed of that. I'm not ashamed of, they're trying to use this against me, but I'm not ashamed of that. And he continues, why? Because I don't love you. God knows that I do. And so he's like, look, God knows I love you. We're going to continue this. He says, but I will continue doing what I have always done. This will undercut those who are looking for an opportunity to boast that their works is just like ours. These people are false prophets. He's letting them know they're false prophets. They are deceitful workers who disguise themselves as apostles of Christ. But I am not surprised. Even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no wonder that his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. In the end, they will get the punishment their wicked deeds deserve. And so he's saying, look, right, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm not changing what I'm doing because these guys are trying to say that I'm not a good apostle because of the way I'm doing anything. He's saying, yeah, basically he's saying my work speaks for itself, right? He's like, this is going to undercut these guys who are looking for a opportunity to boast. All they're doing is boasting about their works. All they're trying to do is make themselves look good. And he's talked about this several times, right? They're only trying to make themselves good. They're trying to tear other people down, right? And this is the thing is if someone's a Christian, a true Christian, right? Or a true teacher, preacher, however you want to do this, they're not going to come in and cut someone else down. Right. And if they do, then you need to be very wary of someone. If someone who claims to be a teacher or a preacher comes in and is tearing someone else down in order to make themselves look better, then you need to be very, very cautious, because that is not Christ-like behavior. That is a behavior of like what Paul called a false apostle, a false teacher, someone who's not really part of Christ. Because, and he says, look, they're going to be punished in the end. And he's like, these guys will be punished in the end. God will take care of them. God knows their heart. God knows their true motives. God knows my true motives. He knows I love you, which he talks about in the previous verse. And so I'm not going to stop doing what I'm doing. He says, Satan disguised himself as an angel of light. And so it's no wonder that his servants are going to do the same thing. And so we've got to be very, very careful. And I'll say all this, right? Being a preacher, being a pastor, being a teacher is hard, right? It's very hard. But we as teachers, preachers, any of those who listen to that, we've got to make sure we do take special care not to do things that we shouldn't be doing. We're going to mess up, but we should never be trying to purposely tear someone down, right? Or purposely try to make others look bad in order to make yourself look good. That's false prophet behavior. That's right. That's not a true Christian or Christ-like teaching or behavior. And not only does it split the church, it makes the church look bad, really bad, especially when all of it comes out. And so we got to be very, very careful, very, very mindful as teachers and preachers and stuff like that when we, not to do anything like this. It can, sometimes human nature steps in, and I get it, but we've got to be very, very careful. The other side of this is us as Christians, we need to test and vet our preachers, our teachers, and our pastors and our elders, right? We cannot just accept people who come in and say they are who they are, right? We just can't accept, oh, I taught this, so you have to believe it. No, we have to study things on our own. We have to do our own work. I think that's one of the biggest problems we see in the church today is no one's really, I'll say no one, but a lot of people are not really vetting things. They're not testing their teachers. They're not saying, hey, what this person teaching, is it true? And I encourage that. I encourage that when I teach, for everyone to do that. Because again, like I said in the beginning, I could be wrong, right? I try my best to study and dive deep and find as many resources as I can when I teach and I preach on things, but I could be wrong. And so I want to make sure I'm not teaching something I shouldn't be, or something that's wrong. And you should, and those out there should say, hey, I don't want something taught to me that's not right. And so we got to be very, very careful to do this, and very, very careful in this. And so, again, Paul confronts the people who are false prophets here and false apostles. And we need to do the same thing. I mean, we need to, if we see someone doing something they shouldn't be, we need to make sure we do that. We need, it's not just the elders and a couple of people's jobs to make sure the church, stays clear of people who are false teachings, because a lot of times it's easy sometimes for these people to get into leadership positions, and then cause havoc or wreak havoc because no one's willing to stand up to them. And so we've got to make sure that we do that stuff. And again, I'm not trying to say this to be negative. It was just, but Paul ran into this early on in in the church history, and so we see this a lot today, and I think it's been part of the reason we've seen so many pastor and preacher and leader failures in the church, because they've kind of been almost given free reign to do what they want. You can't question them. You can't do stuff. And then all of a sudden, all this really bad stuff starts coming out and becomes public about them. And it's like, oh, well, if we would have vetted, if we would have paid attention, if we would have done a little bit more digging, then this wouldn't have happened. And we wouldn't see a lot of churches being completely destroyed because they allowed a wolf, like you see in this picture, or a false preacher or teacher to come in and do things that shouldn't be done. And so we've just got to be very, very careful. But on the flip side of that, there are a lot more awesome preachers and awesome teachers and awesome elders and pastors out there than there are false ones. We know that. But unfortunately, the false ones get all the attention. And so I want to say that I appreciate all those who are out there who are working hard. It's hard. It's a hard job to do this. And we do appreciate everyone out there who does do this and takes the time to be a pastor or a teacher or a preacher in the church, because it's not easy, and it does take up a lot of time, and it's a work, right? It's a true work, and we are very grateful for all those who do this. So I hope that you learned from this. I hope that this is helpful. I hope that this sees that even Paul dealt with crazy stuff early on in the church. And so we'll continue on next week. I think we finish 2 Corinthians next week. Excuse me. And then we'll get into Acts just a little tiny bit, and then I think we go into Romans, which I'm looking forward to. I know it's going to be a lot more study. Romans is very, very, very deep, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So, as always, appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch. If you have not subscribed to our channel, encourage you to do that so you get these daily messages. And as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.